Got to go right up to as best you can, but how's your headphone volume?
Just fine.
Fine.
Here,
okay.
perfect.
Good. And spit out my gum. Okay. Zamba zabawa. So I was only oops. But then, well, whatever. Record that. Okay, so we're gonna do Confederate intelligence. So we're starting at Chancellorsville. Are we gonna go into Gettysburg or just set up?
It's just got a set up. It's not Confederate. It's actually it's pretty much Union.
It's Union and.
So this is.
Okay.
We'll touch on Confederates
Didn't we do that
bit.
already? What did we do last?
So time? we did Union intelligence at Gettysburg, and so it was essentially we talked a little bit about the standing up the BMI, but mostly it was about the intelligence campaign leading up to Gettysburg. This is intelligence at Chancellorsville.
Okay.
So this is specifically this is the founding of the BMI, which we're going to talk more.
Right.
More
so it's the first real use of.
Yeah, and
some
of the new technologies there, the Beardsley communication system, and then the breaking of the codes and things like that. So this is really Chancellorsville.
Okay, and I'm gonna just adjust your camera a little differently here. Oops.
And so you can lead with we talked heavily about kind of a little bit of the founding of the BMI and intelligence at Gettysburg, but now we're going to get a little bit more deep into the first campaign.
All right. Do me a favor, slide the chair over that way a little bit more. Good, okay, I know it's kind of an awkward way to sit, but
no, it's fine.
It's good for the shot. All right.
Although why you'd want a shot of this, I have absolutely no idea.
I know. All right, hi everybody that's watching. Three of you. Michael Lentz, hello. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon. Hey, for those of you who have been following the updates that I've been doing on the whatchamacallit there, I'm going to play this on tomorrow's show, AG Today, but I thought I'll give you a little sneak peek here, if you will. I just played it for Greg, and he was amazed that Bobby Darin had such foresight here, and just give me a second and I'll get to it. I'll set it up for you while I'm looking for it. Back in the 60s, I believe it was 65, Bobby Darin was on a bender one night, and he had an idea for a song. He had a premonition, and he didn't know what it came from. He didn't know what the words didn't make any sense to him, but he foresaw a tragedy in the future, and he got his band together, and they went into the studio. And they recorded this right here.
Goodbye, get out of the car tours. We shall see you no more. It seems free tours are verboten. No more the flag you'll be totin'. History can't be free.
There you go. Such a sad song. Even the walk taller strike again. Yeah, so like this whole AI thing started. I wrote a bunch of songs about everybody on the show, and then I told them that it was from a collective of musicians out in Pittsburgh that call themselves the Walk Tallers, and they're all people who are really talented musicians, but they chose family and normal jobs over music. And so they get together like on a Saturday, and one of them has a studio, and they just, come up with songs and record them. And so they did these songs. And so I did a poll on a later show when I finally confessed that it was all AI. 73% of the audience thought it was real, including Bethany, who's the co-host, and one of the songs is about her, and she was so touched that somebody actually took the time to write a song about her. And then when I told her that it was fake. She was crushed.
Heartbroken, just destroyed as a
She
human being.
was. She was.
I used to love and trust you.
That's exactly what she said. She's like, I thought we were friends. I trusted you. You're a liar, And so anyway, that was that there. So that's what he means by the walk taller strike again. All right, let's get started here. We're going to do, so it's not, the title was wrong, folks. It's not Confederate intelligence gathering. It is intelligence gathering or intelligence at Chancellorsville. Okay. Right. So let me get to my proper bank here, and then we will go. Here we go.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios,
you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Good day to you all. Patrons, that's who this is. This is a Patreon show. Hello, all you patrons, and special hello to the first lieutenants who are watching this being recorded live. And today we are talking with an old friend of ours, and he's got the gray hairs to prove it, right, Greg?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Greg Elder is with us again, and we're talking about intelligence gathering at the Battle of Chancellorsville, or during the Chancellorsville campaign, I guess is probably more appropriate, right? And Greg was on last time talking about the BMI, I believe.
Well, yeah. So I talked about the Bureau of Military Information.
A little closer to that mic, please.
Yeah. So we talked about the battle of the Bureau of Military Information at Gettysburg, and then also Confederate intelligence at Gettysburg. And so what I thought would be interesting today is to talk a little bit more about the founding of BMI and its first actual implications on the battlefield, because, you get to Gettysburg only because of the success of the intelligence at Chancellorsville. And what I mean is you get to the intelligence success at Gettysburg largely through the lessons learned and the practical use of intelligence at Chancellorsville. So I thought that might be interesting to hear about just how impactful it was during that campaign.
Yeah, okay. So let's get into it then. So the BMI, when is it founded?
So the BMI is founded literally right after General Hooker takes command of the Army of the Potomac. So you're talking early
January?
Yeah, January of 1863. And it really comes about, surprisingly, there's a name of a person who virtually nobody knows about. His name is Babcock. And so Babcock had been one of Pinkerton's kind of spies and analysts during the era of the McClellan period. And Babcock sees everything that goes wrong. He's horrified at the type of intelligence reporting that's done. But when Pinkerton and McClellan leave the Army of the Potomac, when McClellan is fired, McClellan and Pinkerton literally take every report that they ever had. So when Burnside, for instance, takes over, there's not a single piece of intelligence reporting. There's not a single Red Force assessment of Confederate intelligence. There's literally nothing. And Babcock thinks he's going to be leaving too. But he's asked to write a report for Burnside about how to stand up a new intelligence organization. So he says, well, I had nothing better to do. I'm going to be leaving anyway because nobody wants me around because I was part of McClellan and Pinkerton, but I'll write this report for you. So he writes this report. He gives it to Burnside, and nothing ever comes of it because, well, Burnside is essentially a paper-cut copy of McClellan. He didn't really do anything in the short period of time that he was the commander with respect to intelligence. So it just goes by the wayside, and Babcock thinks, well, that's pretty much the end of it. But we're talking about a very short period of time between McClellan being fired and Burnside being fired.
Right.
And so Babcock is still around, and he's known to a few people, including Butterfield, who's under the staff of Hooker when Hooker's promoted. And Butterfield talks to Hooker, and both Hooker and Butterfield know something has to be done about intelligence. So if you go back through the McClellan era of intelligence, of course, that's kind of a farce because the word intelligence and McClellan never seem to actually run into each other ever. But the overestimation of Confederate forces by intelligence by Pinkerton during the McClellan era is typically 100 or 200%. So if the Confederates had 50,000, McClellan was going to say at least 100,000. If the Confederates had 75,000, McClellan was likely to say 200,000. Right. And so these numbers are just absolutely bogus. Right. And if you're a military commander, this is one of the important things about intelligence. If you're a military commander and you honestly believe that you're outnumbered, it has grave implications on your risk taking, what you're willing to do and not willing to do.
Right.
So the debate has always been with McClellan is whether or not he was consciously, deliberately kind of overestimating the enemy, or whether it was done because he just had biases and didn't want to risk anything going forward. But when you look at the numbers, and so my favorite period of time for McClellan on intelligence is the couple weeks before and the couple days after the Battle of Antietam. So if you go back to September 9th, 1862, remember that's the Confederates have just crossed the Potomac River. They're moving up to Frederick in lead up to the Battle of Antietam. So on 9 September, McClellan wires Washington that the Confederates have 110,000 troops. We know that the Confederates had at best 55,000. It was probably less than that. There were a lot of Confederate Virginians who were not going to cross the Potomac. They had suffered really grievous casualties at Second Bull Run in the 7 days. So we're looking at about 55,000. And so there's that doubling of the numbers by McClellan. So that's 9 September. 11 September, the Confederates have now received 10,000 more. They have 120,000 men, whereas in reality, the numbers decreased over time. They were probably down to about 50,000 by that time. Now, the day before the Battle of Antietam, Pinkerton and McClellan estimate the Confederates have 100,000 men. So it's gone from 120 to 100 between September 11th and September 16th. Now, that's because McClellan thinks that he won the largest, most significant strategic battle in American history at the Battle of South Mountain. And he estimates the Confederates lost 20,000 men there. They lost about 2,000, overall casualties there, but they've lost 20,000 according to the wire from McClellan to Washington. So if they've lost 20,000, it makes sense that from September 11th to September 16th, their numbers, he estimates, have gone from 120 to 100. So at the Battle of Antietam, with 87,000 men, McClellan thinks that he's facing 100,000 men, which is why, if he really believes that, and that's, of course, the debate of the day, if he really believes that the Confederates have 100,000, he has 87,000, then when he blows open the middle at the Sunken Road, and there's an opportunity to throw an entire corps into the Confederate center, and he doesn't do it, you kind of have a little bit of sympathy for the perspective of saying, well, if the Confederates have 100,000 men, then it makes sense that he's going to be risk averse and not do that.
Sure.
But the bottom line is he never tried to make any efforts to really gain intelligence. So we can belittle and badger him all we want because he never made an effort.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, so he goes into the Battle of Antietam believing the enemy has 100,000 men. After the battle, when Lincoln wires him and says, you really got to move forward, destroy the enemy, don't let them cross the Potomac. And of course, McClellan lets them cross back over the Potomac.
Yeah.
And Lincoln chides him, why didn't you do anything? And he says, McClellan wires back and he says, well, because the Confederates have 140,000 men. So they went from 100,000 men right before the battle. They lost, God knows, according to McClellan, he probably thinks that he killed 50,000 Confederates or something there. We never get a number on how many casualties he knows he inflicted, but he knows he inflicted a large number of losses on the Confederates. So you would expect that 100,000 estimate from the 16th to drop substantially. Instead, between the 16th and the 19th, Lee has not only recouped his losses, but he's also added another 40,000 reinforcements to support
Right. From where?
They just
materialized.
40,000 plus the losses suddenly just regenerate themselves out of nowhere, right?
Right.
And so this is the type of problem that Burnside took over and didn't really care about, but that Hooker, having been through these battles and having seen what was happening and understanding the problems of facing an enemy, if you don't have intelligence and an understanding of their size and composition, why the first thing he does when he becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac is reorganizes the Army and creates the Bureau of Military Information for intelligence, because he knows, I've got to fix this problem. I cannot continue to go forward with this issue. So, lo and behold, by sheer coincidence, when he turns to Butterfield and says, we got to do something about intelligence, Butterfield turns to another staff officer and they get to talk and they find out about this guy named Babcock. And they bring Babcock in, and Babcock says, well, yeah, I wrote this kind of paper on how to create a secret service. And so here's a blueprint essentially handed to Hooker and Butterfield that says, how do we establish a new secret service, a new intelligence organization?
Now, did he just write this in his spare time, or did he write it for
No,
how
so
does
he
he
was-
just
he-
have this laying around?
No, so he was commissioned by Burnside to write this. It's just that when
Okay.
he gave it to Burnside, Burnside just never did anything with it, whether it's because he was fired too quickly or more than likely, he just didn't feel a compelling need to create or establish this organization. But when Hooker comes on board, suddenly here's this plan in front of him, and wow, let's create this organization. So then the next problem becomes, well, who are we going to have oversee this organization, right? So we have a basic blueprint. We kind of know what we want. We want to centralize more intelligence collection. We want to do more analysis. We want to be able to understand how to better develop intelligence requirements to go out and collect new intelligence. So all this is here. Who do we have that's gonna be able to do this? And the other staff officer who is participating in all of this, I think it's General Patrick. He says, "I know this guy." So his name is Sharp, and he's a sharp guy. See what I did with that? See what I did with that?
I saw it. Yeah.
It wasn't very good, but see what I did with that?
Yeah, I saw.
And so he says, I know this guy. He was a regimental commander, but he was also he's a really well-known lawyer, and he was also deep into politics up in New York City. So he knows how to kind of play dirty and run politics and also use the law and everything. Why don't you talk with him? So they bring in George H. Sharp, and lo and behold, now everything comes together. Hooker, in the need for having an intelligence organization, a plan that's been put together by Babcock, and then now you get Sharp comes in, and Sharp then hires Babcock as one of his two aides. He goes out and gets another really sharp guy named McAtee to be his other essential chief of staff and aide for the organization. And then that's how early in January 1863, the formation of the first all-source intelligence organization comes to exist. But I think that even I, who have given a lot of credit to Hooker in my own writings on intelligence, as kind of the founder of all-source intelligence, the real kind of back channel person who really made that possible was Babcock, first in having seen how to do it wrong, how to do it poorly under Pinkerton, and then actually writing the blueprint on how to do it right, and Hooker taking it over.
McAtee, is he a civilian or a military guy?
He's military.
Okay.
But these are scouts. So one of the things that the Union under Hooker immediately started doing, and with Sharp and all, looking for who do I bring into this organization to kind of oversee the scouting missions and to collect intelligence. We can't have guys who sound like they're from New York City, right? This
Right,
year's
right.
made in New York City, right? We can't have that accent and everything. We can't have people from clearly the North and the Northeast going behind enemy lines and trying to portray themselves as Confederates, right? So
yeah.
who do I have in my army who can play that kind of role? And they found the 3rd Indiana Cavalry. And the 3rd
Indiana's kind of a southern accent.
and at least a Western kind of
Right,
unique accent,
right.
where the Confederates themselves, if you said I'm from Tennessee and you're from Indiana, well, there was most Confederates couldn't tell the difference between a Tennessee accent and an Indiana accent. So Sharp immediately drawed heavily on the 3rd Indiana to recruit from for scouts and for his staff, because they weren't just people who he could have look at information. They were people who he could send behind enemy lines and actually start gathering information. And so you have several of these members from the 3rd Indiana, Babcock, who had already been involved in intelligence operations for a while. Then they start recruiting a few of the locals, a guy named Otto. There was also a spy who had been actually working under the provost marshal in Richmond as a spy for the Union there, who comes over to Union lines, and he becomes part of the BMI. And so Sharp is really remarkable in gathering a team of people right away who he understands is going to be effective at doing what they're doing, right? He didn't just get the smart person from New York City who he couldn't do anything with aside from looking at analysis. Right. He really gathered the right people. One of them, a guy named Klein, very early on in the intelligence reporting cycle for what was going to be the Battle of Chancellorsville, he puts on a Confederate uniform. He crosses the line so they had two paid African Americans on the staff of the BMI, which a lot of people freaked out about, but it's part of that ongoing understanding and appreciation for an entire body of intelligence and information out there that hadn't been utilized before. If you're going to reach out to the African American population, on the other side of the river, the slaves, the contraband, the servants who were operating with the Confederate forces, you're not going to send, the white guy over the river to do that. If you can bring somebody, who has experience in operating in that region, who's an African American themselves, who can go over the river to do that. So they hired a couple of really sharp African Americans to also start collecting information and developing resources behind enemy lines to do that. But they also found these African American members of the team essentially also were people who knew where they could cross the Rapidan and Rappahannock River undetected, because that's really important. If you're going to get behind enemy lines, you've got to know where to cross those two major rivers.
Right.
So Klein, he gets behind enemy lines and he rides up, and sure enough, he finds a member of essentially like Lee's staff riding along the lines, and he says, "Look, I'm one of Lee's new staff members. I'm coming from and I forget the exact story, but it's like I'm coming from the Shenandoah, and I'm supposed to meet with Lee and become part of the staff." And this other officer says, "Well, look, I'm riding up and down the entire line right now. You're happy to ride along with me, and we can, have a campfire and talk with people, and you can get acclimated to the situation and where everything's at." So Klein, over the course of the next few days, rides 50 miles up and down the entire Confederate line, maps all of the different buildings where all the artillery batteries are, how many pieces are in reserve, vice up front, the specific regiments, how much food they were getting, so the calorie intake for the average Confederate soldier. And then he crosses back over into Union lines with essentially an entire makeout of the Confederate forces and where they were deployed.
Wow.
So right away, there's these things.
That's really sophisticated stuff. I mean, in a very short amount of time, they're able to pull this all together in that way.
Yeah,
it's impressive.
Absolutely. And there's other ways that there's a story about an African American couple called the Dabneys, and actually they believe that because they thought for a while that the husband's name was Dabney. Now we find out that there's a little bit about the history in terms of their names that's a little wrong. But what we do know is there was a husband-wife team of contrabands of former slaves. They crossed over to Union lines, and they started cleaning clothes and helping the Union war effort by essentially acting as servants, paid servants, but servants for the Union Army. And one day, the husband, he goes out and he sees a Union flag, a flag communication staff, like waving the flags back and forth, communicating, Signal Corps, waving the flags to another position. He says, well, what are you guys doing? And they just basically not tell him too much, but say, well, you see over there on that hill when they wave the flags, they're telling us something, and when we wave the flags, we're telling them something. And he goes like, wow. And he goes back and he talks to his wife, and they come up with this really brilliant plan, and they go to the Bureau of Military Information, to Colonel Sharp, and they lay it out to him, and he accepts it. And what it is his wife, and talk about courage here, right? Just like Klein going behind enemy lines, like the courage that it takes with something like this. She is going to cross the Rappahannock River, re-enter Confederate lines, go to essentially the headquarters area, and offer herself up as a maid for the headquarters staff. So she makes her way over there, and they say, well, wow, you could really use somebody to clean our clothes and help clean up around here. She finds a piece of high ground that she knows that the Union can observe her from, because she has seen from the other side of the river where you could see things.
Wow.
And she puts up a clothesline.
Like what do they call the Culper?
Something like the Culper spy ring, yeah, where they use the clothesline for information.
Yeah.
And she gives a different color shirt for every one of the divisions in Lee's army. And so every time she gets new information, she goes out and she will place, if one of the divisions is Hill, right? Well, Hill's going to be a blue shirt. And so, suddenly the blue shirt is on the far left. That means Hill's division is in place and it's on the far left. And the Union can go out every day, and from their own signal position, they can see this clothesline, and they're able to report fresh intelligence every day on the disposition of all of the major Confederate units. So
clever.
So there's all of these different things that begin to start happening right with the creation of this organization. And so there's always been, the Union always had kind of human intelligence spies, right? But the unique thing that comes with the Bureau of Military Information is that by centralizing a now organization whose job it is to collect all forms of intelligence, not just the spies, but everything else, and put them together, Now suddenly there's interrogations, right? So they're going to go and they're going to interrogate prisoners or people who come across the lines. They come up with the first official U.S. interrogation plan in the history of the country, an actual plan on how to actually conduct interrogations to get the most out of the people who they're interrogating. So they professionalize interrogations. They get released Union, when there's trades for Union and Confederate prisoners. They are going to go now and talk to every Union prisoner who makes their way back from Richmond, from those trades, to gather information. What did you see when you were in Richmond? You were on the train coming back here. Could you see anything? Did you get any understanding of logistics and what was moving around? Were there any other trains around that had cannon or something on them? So they're using now these Union prisoners who have been released, the contraband and the freed slaves, right, from the local area. So whenever there's a runaway slave who makes their way to Union lines, now you're going to actually, essentially interrogate them or brief them. Hey, what did you see when you were moving here? Did you see Confederate troops? Where did you see them? Where did you escape from? How did you make your way here? Many of these folks, so every single Confederate regiment had something on the order of 30 slaves who were acting as servants for each regiment. Well, when you add that up for how many regiments, there's 390 something regiments in the Confederate Army. Many of them went south with Longstreet, so that number decreases. But basically, of all of Lee's forces who are still there, all those regiments, when you start adding 30 or so slaves, body servants for every single regiment, that acts as a really large number of slaves who are who are operating with the Army, who hear everything that's happening about the Army, who are moving around behind the enemy lines, who suddenly are really great pieces of information when they come in to ask them, hey, wow, you were a servant for who? Oh, well, for Colonel so-and-so of the 16th, North Carolina. Well, tell me about the 16th North Carolina. Oh, well, they just had a whole bout of chickenpox or something. Those types of information really are significant. So the African Americans, then scouts and spies. So now we start actually being more aggressive in sending forward people like Klein, who are going to scout and spy enemy positions by going behind enemy lines. So there's that. The cavalry. Now, the cavalry and BMI never had a good relationship. So, Sharp wants to use the cavalry for intelligence. Hey, go out there, scout, surveil enemy lines, get behind their forces, and come back and report. But of course, the cavalry does a lot more than just collect intelligence. They also have to protect your rear, your lines of supply, and do other things as well. And so there was always kind of this friction between Sharp and the cavalry, and they didn't always come eye to eye. But the BMI did get a lot of information from the cavalry as well. So the cavalry becomes a source. Balloons. So during this campaign, it's not until after the Battle of Chancellorsville that essentially Lowe starts to pitch a fit about not getting paid enough for operating his balloon corps, and the fact that he is probably being corrupt in terms of stealing and pilfering money from the U.S. government. All of this comes to light after the Battle of Chancellorsville. But up until the Battle of Chancellorsville, there's a U.S. balloon corps of several balloons that are being put up every day. And we know their impact because General Longstreet writes about it after the war and says, we felt like we couldn't move any of our forces during the day. Like we were absolutely locked in where we were until nighttime, because every time one of those balloons went up, we knew that we were being observed.
Right.
Now, we also know that those balloons weren't as effective as what you might think. A lot of people went up in the balloons just to be able to tell their family and everything, I went up in a balloon. So the Confederates would see this balloon up there and think, oh my God, they're spying on us, when in fact it's some colonel up there with a bottle of champagne going, woo, I get to be in a balloon. Also, any sort of wind, they hadn't learned how to kind of hold them in place. So any sort of wind got them spinning around.
Oh, that must have been fun.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the balloons weren't as effective as the Confederates thought, but they were still there, and they still were able to gather information, for instance, campfires and things like that, major concentrations of force. Movements along the roads. That was all stuff that the balloons could see. Capture documents. Now you're going to bring in all the captured mail that, you capture a mail courier with bags of mail, and you're going to bring that back to Union lines. And now, instead of just throwing it away or not caring about it, the BMI is going to piece all that together as vital intelligence as well. So there's document exploitation that's happening. Probing, reconnaissance, open source intelligence. So the newspapers, one of the things that had really benefited the Confederates was they were the ones who more aptly used newspapers because they had a service that moved 7 to 9 newspapers every day from Washington, D.C. to Richmond within 24 hours. So they were getting fresh newspapers and fresh reporting on the Union every day. And then also they had a quid pro quo between soldiers down at the Rappahannock River, the pickets. And the Union wanted tobacco. So they would say, hey, brother Confederate, do you have some tobacco? I'll trade you. And then the Confederates would say, well, yeah, hey, we're really interested in the news. We don't have any newspapers over here. Would you give us the latest newspaper? And so the Union was more apt to give information away that would reveal dangerous things about themselves, whereas the Union would get tobacco to smoke.
It's how evil that nicotine is.
It is. It's not. Well, and I'm gonna go to the Union Cigar Lounge myself after this and have some of that.
They moved to Hanover. I'm sorry. This will move to Carlisle. They're not here anymore. Yeah. Sorry. You'd have to go to another town. There's the one over by Rita's.
Yeah. Okay. All right. You just destroyed my thought.
They
momentum.
did it, not me.
And
they moved. I would have kept them there, but
that hurts. That was a great. Anyway, sorry.
I mean, anyway, day.
But Hooker cracks down, and the BMI cracks down on pickets sharing information because they know that the Confederates are the ones actually benefiting from this. So they shut down all quid pro quo with the enemy. That's one of the things. Lee writes a really terse letter to Jefferson Davis shortly after the Bureau of Military Information is established, and he says, I'm not getting hardly any information anymore. I'm completely dry on intelligence because the Union has shut down the newspaper lines. They're not trading anything with our troops anymore. Their cavalry is stopping our scouts from going behind their enemy lines, and they've thrown all the reporters out of the Army, so there's not all these newspaper reporters writing about what's happening in the Army of the Potomac every day. So Lee clearly sees early on the impact of what's happening during this period of time in terms of operational security.
Right. So he doesn't necessarily know what is happening. He just knows something is changing. Something different is afoot.
And then he does see in the newspapers that he is getting, and he does get a very clear idea that suddenly the Union is really looking for contrabands, are really seeking out African Americans to cross over to their lines for information. He puts out another circular to his army saying, be on the lookout for what you say, who you say it to, and whether or not there's your body servants around, because they are being a principal source of intelligence for the Union Army right now.
That had to be a precarious situation for them, right?
Yeah, they're not. We can't really acknowledge them as a danger and as human beings, but they're a danger, and they are, after all, human beings.
Right?
So that's really complicated. But he's putting out these circulars where you're able to read that generally is clearly cognizant that something's happening, and he's worried, and yet he's not exactly too sure just how impressive the information gathering campaign is against him in these months leading up to Chancellorsville.
I guess lucky for Lee, according to a documentary I saw called Gods and Generals, most of the slaves just prayed with their masters. They loved being slaves. They would never turn on them.
I don't know about that. I think what you would say is most of them didn't know enough because they weren't allowed to read. They weren't given access to outside information.
They loved that, didn't they? They were very happy.
Okay, so good. Okay,
I'm being sarcastic.
Okay, because
you didn't hear. I said in a documentary called Gods and Generals.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, of course they're. Yeah. Well, hey, sir.
Hey, everybody's happy.
I love. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll stand out here in the freezing cold while everybody else is inside and pray with you on your damn horse. You crazy bastard.
But there's an interesting thing about Gods and Generals, and why what you're saying is not altogether a little bit serious, is the fact that Jackson refused. He created a prayer group for African Americans and taught them how to read.
Yeah.
Right. And so when
he's a hero.
Well, he's not a hero, obviously, but when we talk about like the city of, when he was teaching at VMI, they wanted to throw him out because he was teaching African Americans how to read, slaves how to read.
Yeah.
And he refused to stop doing that. So I would say he had a little bit of a different, when you talk to the slaves of the area around where he was teaching, they actually spoke very highly of
And
him.
I'm sure
But
there were
yeah,
plenty in that case. Yeah,
but as slaves overall, and especially working for the Confederate Army, you were generally worked to death, right? In horrible weather conditions, in the heat and everything like that. You were
Right.
given less food. The Confederates weren't being fed lots as it is. In fact, there's an interesting kind of intel story with respect to the Confederate logistics. The president of the railroad between Richmond and Fredericksburg was a Union sympathizer and spy. And he intentionally mismanaged the railroad so that if 2 trains could make their way every day from Richmond to Fredericksburg, he would make sure only one made its way there. It was the most mismanaged, piss poor railroad in the country, and Lee complained about it all the time. Like, why aren't we getting more trains? Why aren't we getting more food? And they would always say, well, we'll talk to the owner of the president or the president of the railroad. And he would always say, oh, well, there's just difficulties. Our stock isn't rolling very well. And so Lee's army was effectively being starved to death. In Fredericksburg. Remember, why is Longstreet sent
he's
away?
looking for food.
For food, right?
Yeah,
For stocks for his horses to
Right.
eat and for his men. That is in large
So
part
that
because
was
of an intentional
sabotage.
effort by a sympathizer who's controlling the railroad there. And the Confederates, believing in private property, did not believe it was their place to go and actually take the railroad away. The Union made a much more concerted effort to take kind of control of the railroad services to make sure that they had the most functioning capabilities possible for their logistics. The Confederates didn't do that. And so they were essentially starving. He was essentially starving the Confederate army before the Battle of Chancellorsville. So
That's awesome.
so these different little things are happening to Lee's army, and he sees all of this, but he doesn't know what he can do really about it.
Yeah.
Now, he does have a spy, and we don't know to this day who his spy was that provides us information. He had a guy named Stringfellow up operating around the Capitol. He had another spy named Conrad who was also getting some information. Anyway, one of the spies provided him intelligence that the Union was preparing for a major campaign, and that the major campaign included a major feint from Falmouth crossing the river over into Fredericksburg. That was the feint, while the rest of the army was going to provide a large circular route around Lee's left flank, right? So, but this was about a month before the Battle of Chancellorsville. So he got this piece of information. Well, what does he do? He files it away with all the other information he gets in case something starts happening, but he doesn't immediately see anything happening. And so you kind of get this sense that maybe he either didn't believe the information, forgets about it, or it happens long enough afterwards that he doesn't think that that piece of information is relevant when the Chancellorsville campaign begins. But he's at a real disadvantage compared to the Union. The difference between the Union collection effort and the Confederate collection effort here, we begin to see what's going to happen for the remainder of the Civil War, a really major divergence where the Union, just like how they improve their cavalry with the reorganization and start arming them with Spencer repeating rifles, just like they start reorganizing their artillery and their formations into the different corps with more esprit de corps and things like that. We start seeing under Hooker, despite his kind of battlefield failure as a commander of the Army of the Potomac, the things that he does during those first couple of months of taking charge and reorganizing the army, providing them better food, giving them leave, creating the Bureau of Military Information, reorganizing the cavalry, right? Doing these things, you start to see that immediate kind of break where you start seeing now the Union being a lot more competitive in the field compared to obviously what they had been under Burnside and McClellan. And so there's a really interesting, historic event that happens during this campaign. A almost identical thing happens during the Midway campaign in World War II, where a deception campaign literally enables a major operation to happen here. And this happens because of the Bureau of Military Information in Chancellorsville. So the Union knows where all the different Confederates are in their line of defense along the Rappahannock and Rapidan River. And they know that the Confederate left flank is being covered exclusively by Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. So they start to think, how are we going to get around the Confederate flank when we know that it's being guarded, and that any maneuver we make toward the Confederate left flank is obviously going to be seen and reported to Lee, and Lee will be able to respond to it very rapidly. We've got to find a way to resolve that issue. So the Union had broken all the Confederate telegraph signals and communications, so they could read every single communication that the Confederates were putting out, whether it was by flags or captured mail or whatever. They could read everything. they knew that the Confederates couldn't read most of the Union traffic, but that they could read a couple of specific, really easy communications codes. So one day, using one of the easy communications codes they knew the Confederates could break, they had 2 signal stations flag each other. And one of them said, hey, be on the lookout to your rear. You're going to see a large Union cavalry force moving towards the Shenandoah Valley. They're going to go there and raise hell in the Shenandoah Valley before Lee can do anything about it. Ha ha, and kind of talking. You're like, oh, well, we're going to go kick their butts, right? Mm-hmm. And then they knew, because the Confederates were watching, that probably was broken. It was. It made its way to General Lee. General Lee read it and kind of waffled over whether or not it was real or not, but then said, I've got to treat it seriously. So he then sends a communique out to his own flag officer saying, hey, let us know when that's happening. By the way, we're also sending our cavalry. Jeb Stuart is going to move from his positions along the Rappahannock River towards Culpeper and the Shenandoah Valley. Well, the Union broke that code. They see that Lee bought the hook, line, and sinker. And so now they have every reason to believe that the left flank is open for them to be able to exploit, that Hooker can now create his large sweeping flanking maneuver around Lee's left flank. But from an intelligence perspective, you have to be able to corroborate that. You have to be able to validate. Before you start your operation, you don't want to get there and find out, oh God, Stuart is still here, right?
Right.
So you've got to be able to corroborate that. So they made a concerted effort over the next week to see what the Confederates knew was going on and whether or not Jackson had really moved. And so I put together, it's kind of interesting, how all source intelligence, all those different sources that I mentioned, the contrabands, the scouts and spies, the newspapers, the balloons, all these different pieces of information coming together, how you're able to corroborate now what's happening and give Hooker the absolute confidence that he's going to be able to execute the type of operation he wants by conducting a major flanking movement. So from interrogations, right? So there's hundreds of interrogation reports. Among them, on the 15th of April, a deserter corroborates the fact that the enemy, that the Confederate left is completely wide open. And on the 26th, just before the actual campaign begins, deserters from 3 separate divisions indicate that nobody in the Confederate Army was expecting any sort of attack, and that the left flank was open. So 2 different interrogation reports over the course of 2 weeks corroborate what's happening there. Captured documents. On the 22nd of April, captured mail details the movement of the cavalry from Stuart's cavalry from the left out to Culpeper, thereby opening up the left flank, right? So now captured mail document exploitation provides that. Union forays and cavalry operations behind Confederate lines reported the arrival of brigades at Culpeper from Jackson. So now the cavalry is corroborating Jackson's move to Culpeper as well. Open source intelligence, the Richmond Enquirer identified that there was no pickets or any forces on the Confederate left at all. And here's what I love about the press is that they always care so much for our national security and our security overall, that they're willing to do things like just openly say, by the way, General Lee's entire left flank is completely up in the air and nobody's protecting it.
Yeah.
God bless the Richmond
They're so
Enquirer.
wonderful.
Balloons. So they found that the enemy camps were quiet, no signs that there was any impending movement, that the Confederates weren't operating in a way that they suspected. The Union was ready to conduct operations at all, and that there was nothing on the left flank. Again, that's from balloons.
Now, meanwhile, the Confederates, obviously, they don't have balloons.
No,
right?
They tried. They
did.
So they got enough. They got enough materials from homespun and cloth and things like that to make one balloon, and they put it on a barge. And while it was going down, I forget, maybe it was the James River or something, to where they were actually going to really put it together, it got caught and snagged on like a branch or something and got torn to pieces. And so they never finished it and put it up. And Longstreet would reminisce about how downtrodden he was as a result of that, not ever having been able to put up their own balloon, because again, like I said, he really was terrified of balloons. When the Union Balloon Service went away, if for no other reason than just to deceive the Confederates into thinking that these balloons were the greatest thing ever invented, the Union really lost a capability there. Had the Union had a couple of balloons here at Gettysburg,
right,
the Confederates would have been really wary about moving Longstreet's forces, against the Union left,
Right.
about what was happening over on the right in terms of, for instance, the Stonewall Brigade being outside of town. There's ways that having a balloon would have really benefited the Union, but Theodore Lowe and the Union government just couldn't come to terms.
Why? What was what really ultimately ended the balloons?
So some people really said they're really not worth the logistical difficulties. I mean, so the generators and everything to operate these balloons were huge. It took a lot of logistics effort to be able to move them.
Right.
And what are we really getting from them? Let's put it this way. Sharp did not go and bang his fist on a table and say the balloons are, the savior the savior of the Union Army. We've got to keep them. He didn't ever say that. But really, Theodore Lowe, it appears, was extremely corrupt. He was pilfering a lot of money. He wasn't conducting as many operations as he said he was, those types of things. And on the other side, the Union Army was just sick of dealing with him. Just honestly, just sick of dealing with, because he was overbearing. He was a jerk, and he didn't make it easy for them to be able to work with him. And so it was just, when the army started moving north to Gettysburg, and the fight happened with Theodore Lowe, I think they just pretty much washed their hands of him and said, we're done.
Right.
And that meant in 1864, during that overland campaign, when things were a lot more stagnant and moving a lot more slowly, where you could have used those balloons to keep a clear eye on the enemy and what was happening in their rear. When you're on the move, it's a lot more difficult to be able to utilize those balloons. So here at Gettysburg, moving them here would have been difficult. You could make some maybe sort of argument for, well, it's just too hard to do it. But in the overland campaign in 64, and then the Petersburg campaign, to be able to map out all of the Confederate lines of defense and dispositions, there was a real gap there in terms of not using balloons.
Corruption aside, was it that the Army just found that whatever they did get from the use of balloons that was useful wasn't really that much, and maybe the balloons weren't ready for prime time yet, and they didn't even think to bring them back?
And if you're the seniors, you're getting what we call finished intelligence reports now from Sharp. He's not really necessarily detailing and everything, like 40% of my information came from balloons, 20% of my information came from balloons. So they're not seeing specifically how much of the information is coming from balloons. Sharp knows that he's getting some, but he also knows it's a pain in the ass dealing with everything. And so, he just doesn't pitch a fit. So I think a large part of it kind of goes on him. And the urgency of operations at the time, he's more worried about, I've got to get my scouts in the field. I've got to collect this other information. Oh, we got to move to get it. We got to move north now because the Confederates are now moving to invade Pennsylvania. And I just think that it just goes by the wayside.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So go ahead.
But so finishing up, just now, this is not all these reports that I'm talking about were just on whether or not the Confederates had forces. Jeb Stuart's forces were on their left. This isn't all the other things about how many soldiers were in the Confederate Army, how many pieces of artillery they had, how much food they were getting, all this other stuff they were getting information on as well. But regarding the left also, so from contrabands from the runaway slaves, the husband and wife team, the Dabneys, in talking and putting the shirts up, moved Jeb Stuart's colored shirt off the grid. So now suddenly Stuart's shirt is no longer on the clothesline. So that's another real, picture perfect piece of information that's timely, that shows that he is no longer there. So you have all of these different pieces of information coming from multiple different services, all telling you the same thing, so that when Sharp goes to Hooker and says the Confederate left is wide open, we have an open avenue to get into their left flank and get behind them, Hooker has a piece of confidence that he's never had, or no Union Army has ever had before in the field, is having all of these different pieces of information put together in a way that he actually can get
do
it.
something with.
2 weeks before the Battle of Antietam, Sharp puts together his first kind of cumulative summation of the size of Lee's army. Now, you have to remember that Pinkerton had been giving estimates that were 100%, 200% off. The first estimate that Sharp gives Hooker, we look back on now, and it was about 15, 20% over the size of the army. But when you remember that with Longstreet gone, that Lee's army was about 48, 49,000 men, he gave an estimate that said roughly about 60,000 men, something like that. given the fact that Hooker had how many people at Chancellorsville?
Like 120?
Yeah, a sick amount, like an enormous
Right.
army of 120,000 men. The high number Sharp gives him 2 weeks before the battle still has Hooker outnumbering Lee 2-1.
Okay.
And they're getting real all source intelligence also in terms of where Longstreet is, because there's kind of two intelligence requirements. Is the left open, and where's Longstreet? Because if Longstreet returns, that changes the calculus, right?
Yeah.
So we care about where Longstreet is. So he's getting intelligence wired and telegraphed to Washington, D.C. and making its way back from down in Norfolk area where Longstreet was. That say, hey, Longstreet's still in our front, right? So we know Longstreet's not there, and now we've gotten to a point where we can articulate the fact that Lee is outnumbered 2-1 by Hooker. When you go a couple weeks later, just before the battle.
Mother.
Sorry? Oh,
It's a song.
yeah,
Just before the battle. No. Just before the battle, Mother is the
Oh.
name of a song. Just before the battle, Mother.
Is that a 60s song?
No, it's a Civil War song.
Oh, I was testing you. See, I was
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah,
Good job.
thank
Way
you.
to go. So the Union estimate that Sharp gives just before the battle to Hooker is 2% off. It's 2%. So we've gone from 200% off
Yeah.
to 2% off.
Pretty good.
So, for instance, there's two divisions of Longstreet's corps that are still with Lee, Anderson and McLaws, right? McLaws is actually the first element to actually engage the Union forces in the Battle of Chancellorsville. So the official numbers that we know from today's numbers were that Anderson had 8,000 men, McLaws had 8,300 men. The BMI said that Anderson had 8,200 men and McLaws had 6,500 men. There's 2% off on Anderson. There's a 22% delta on McLaws. They didn't have as much information on McLaws because when Longstreet left, they lost some visibility on what was happening from Longstreet's division, some of the sources that they were using there. But when you go to some of the others, A.P. Hill's division, they were off by 2%. Early's division, they were off by 1%. So Early's division had 8,297. The BMI estimated 8,400. So they didn't just come up with a single number that they just put across all the divisions. Like we think every Confederate division has 8,700 men. No, they knew they made assessments on every single division uniquely based on the number of regiments, based on illness, based on number of based on sicknesses and things like that. Trimble's division, they got within 2% as well. So the infantry subtotal was less than 5% off. And then when you added Stuart's cavalry, it brought it to the official numbers that Lee had at Chancellorsville was 56,492. The BMI's assessment of Lee was 55,300, so less than 2%.
Wow.
So now Hooker, you can
pretty
imagine, has really all the information he needs to be successful.
Yeah.
The fact that, of course, the Union loses the Battle of Chancellorsville is because it's one of the most brilliantly fought battles, at first by both sides, because Hooker has a brilliant plan, and until the point of contact, the execution of it is flawless.
Which always surprised me. I mean, I never really studied Chancellorsville that deep to know how they were able to do it. But I mean, it's hard to imagine that such a force could go unnoticed and unchecked.
Their march, they did a very good job of masking the movement. And then, of course, they made the main movement look like it was going to be from Falmouth across Fredericksburg.
Yeah,
so
they
they
had the feint.
intentionally made that look very, very obvious. And the number of troops, Sedgwick's entire corps, the largest of the army, 22,000 men, makes their way across the Rappahannock River. There's all sorts of movement to make it look like that's the beginning of a major operation. So when the Confederates are seeing this movement, they're not necessarily
looking in the right direction.
It moving in the flanking movement. So they rapidly march overnight and are able, because there's no Confederates essentially holding the fords there, they're able to get around the Union or the Confederate left. But the reason they were able to do that was because they had a very strong idea that the Union left was completely up in the air, and that they knew that they outnumbered the Confederates, and that the 55,000 Confederates there were all massed in front of them in Fredericksburg, right?
Right.
So the planning is the effect of, one, good military operational planning, but also predicated on the intelligence that says we've been successful in freeing up the Confederate left. So everything from the intelligence and planning perspective goes right. It's just that when you hit the point of execution, which of course where you see the Corps commander lose their mind when Hooker says, let's stop in the woods.
Right.
Right. Well, the entire point was to get out in the open
Right.
where we could use the full mass of our soldiers in the
Crush 'em.
open. And with all of our artillery, which we significantly outnumber them in artillery, and we just sent our cavalry way behind their lines to disrupt their railroads and everything. Like everything has come together now. Why would we want to fight in the woods where we can't use the bulk of our forces?
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, then the Hooker that we all talk about comes out, but the lead up all the way from the concept of how do we get at Hooker, or how do we get at Lee, given the fact that Burnside has already tried the frontal assaults, right? 13 frontal assaults obviously was not one of the brighter ideas in military history, right?
But not lucky number 13. Is that a lucky number?
And then let's doing a mud march in the middle of really crappy weather and everything that really
Right.
doesn't work. So let's figure this out. And he figures it out, and he gets the intelligence to do so. Now, during the battle, the intelligence is also still really good because they already have a blueprint. They know every single division's manpower. Like I said, very, very astutely, they know. So when McLaws shows up, they have an idea of how many men McLaws have. When the rest of Jackson's corps starts making their way over, they know the size of Jackson's corps, so they know the number of soldiers that they're arrayed against as the battle is happening. So during the battle, this is all helping. There's also the Birdsley machine, which is the first time ever attempt to try to essentially move telegraph with the pace of operations so that you can communicate between two different elements of an army via telegraph instead of by horses. So the idea here is now maybe we can even relate intelligence more quickly and orders as well by using this Beardsley machine. And the Union put a lot of time and effort into thinking that this was going to work. And one of the biggest failures of the Battle of Chancellorsville is that when Hooker sends the orders over to Sedgwick to not just like stay in Fredericksburg, but to attack and take the heights and get in Lee's rear, the Beardsley machine breaks. And the telegraph that's supposed to go to Sedgwick spends like 6 or 9 hours sitting in an office, not going anywhere. And during that period of time, Sedgwick says, well, I'm just supposed to just sit here and keep waiting in the city.
Okay.
And in that meantime, that's when the Union Army gets hit really hard by Jackson, when it would have been optimal for Sedgwick to have gotten behind the line. So the first effort to try to use kind of, electronic communications to be able to more aptly and effectively send timely intelligence fails. That's one of the failures that comes out of this battle. But of course, after that, they start learning their lessons and they begin to fix that too. So even the use of the telegraph becomes more essential and capable after the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Confederates didn't have any of this, and Lee was completely surprised. So in Falmouth, when the Union moved into Fredericksburg, he was worried about that being the real attack. When he started getting the pieces of intelligence that there was a large Union movement around his flank, he didn't know what to do there. And so he's really up in the air because he hadn't, despite having a spy report in advance of this, what they thought was going to happen, he had no other corroborating information, and he was completely up in there. He did not know what to do. And any other general, I'm certain of this, any other general virtually in military history is going to see themselves between the pincer of two enormous forces, and are going to retreat to the next river line, North Anna or something like that, and give up Fredericksburg. But he doesn't, because it's generally. So that's the significance of this.
So again, I'm impressed with how quickly they were able to pull this all together and only be off by 2% as far as the numbers of troops that Lee has. I mean, I underestimate the intelligence of people who lived long ago, but there's smart people back then, and a lot of what we have today was invented or created or stumbled upon by very smart people back in those days. So I don't know why I'm so arrogant that way, but I guess that's just a normal.
In one way, I like to think people back then were even sharper and more intelligent because they read.
Yeah.
They read all the time. They weren't sitting and watching television all the time or whatever. Now that doesn't mean today our people aren't more intelligent, and that somehow like the internet also doesn't provide education. But I know that my kids are getting a lot less education from the internet today than little Billy and Susie, who would have been forced to have read, all of Homer's works and everything back then. So
no, I agree with you on that. I think we are a lot dumber now.
And so, when we think about that, the folks, when we're talking about people like Sharp and we're talking about people like Lee and everything, is that these were genuinely really sharp people. They were smart. They got this.
Yeah.
But they had to learn the hard way in many cases to be able to get to where they got, just like today. We still have to learn lessons.
Sure, trial and error and all that other jazz. What so obviously, we had talked about Gettysburg before and the BMI's doings in this campaign. And I what I thought was interesting was that they were able, like in that campaign, they were able to tell where Stuart was, I think, by the cut telegraph wires, like where the cuts are made and things like that.
They knew where Stuart was the entire time because the press and all the townspeople. Also, they had a signal station on top of God, they call it a mountain here, and it drives me crazy. Sugarloaf. Yeah, there are no mountains around here. But I'm from Colorado. These are pimples. These are hills. But they had, for instance, a signal station on top of there. They knew there was always continuous kind of information flowing in on where, and there was a cavalry detachment too who was following Stuart the entire way. So they had a pretty good idea where Stuart was most of the way. The bigger thing was the order of battle and where they were moving. Once Lee got on the move, it's where's he moving to, where are his different corps. At one point in time, the Union is so well aware of what's going on. The entire Union Army makes it across the Potomac despite Lee's advanced march. The entire Army of the Potomac moves across the Potomac before Lee's entire army does. But the really important thing that comes out of Chancellorsville is that after the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Union knew precisely the size of Lee's army, even the casualties. So it took about a week and a half to 2 weeks after the battle to come to terms with what they figured the real casualty rate or casualties of the Confederate Army was. That's important because if you start with 55,000 men is what you believe that Lee has, and you can now subtract the number of casualties, that gives you, again, a very clear picture of what you're facing. And it took about 2 weeks using all that all-source intelligence, the press, a lot of press out of Richmond about what was happening with all the wounded, the percentage of the army that was impacted. So sometimes they would not print the size of Lee's army, but they would say, 18% of Lee's army is no longer in action. Well, if you know what Lee's army is, that 18% is easy. That was something that the Union press screwed up all the time. They would say that 8% of the Union army is currently in Washington, D.C. sick. Well, okay, great. If you said in previous press reports that the Union Army was X number of men, 8% from that is. But after 2 weeks, the Union, the Bureau of Military Information reported to Hooker that the Confederates had suffered 14,800 casualties, and they had suffered 13,900 casualties in the battle. So it was very, very close there too, the number of casualties. So they were able to write up, what the losses were. When Longstreet returned, they were pretty accurate in terms of what Longstreet's forces were. And so they already began the campaign with a very firm understanding of what forces Lee had. And the one disparity that happens during the campaign, because during the march, they're simply unable to prove what the exact numbers are. They knew that Lee got reinforcements from North Carolina. They couldn't validate what the size of those were. And they knew that he got reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley, but they couldn't validate those. And they overestimated Lee's number by about 15% because they overestimated how many troops were sent from those two locations.
So they're really good at giving Hooker information about Confederate dispositions leading into the campaign. I know Hooker was receiving information from Howard and other people that there's, the Jackson's on the right and their flank has been turned. How about the BMI? Are they giving him that information too? What's going on? And if they are, doesn't he trust them? Haven't they served him well enough so far? Like what's...
No, so they weren't So when you get to that level of granular tactical level, they weren't out all over the place in the field.
Okay.
Sharp was with Hooker the entire time, and he was making sure that he was synthesizing the information that was coming in. You have to remember that Sickles saw the Jackson's movement and actually attacked the rear of
Oh,
of the
that's
movement.
right. Yeah.
So there was information, and of course Hooker sends information out to Howard that says, watch your right flank. We're pretty sure the Confederate Army is moving that way. Now we think they're retreating towards the Shenandoah Valley, so we think this is a retreat, but you've got to watch yourself out there. So there was the information there. What Sharp and them were doing was saying, so we understand that Hill's division is moving out there right now and Rhodes' division is moving out there. You should know that what that means, Rhodes' division has, 7,600 men in it, and Hill's division has 8,900 men in it. So when we're talking about the movement of those forces around to the right, we're talking about, 15,000 Confederates moving in that direction. So there is a constant relaying of information of, if we can find out what units are in which locations, we can tell him that. And remember, they were capturing Confederates too. There were also deserters that they were interrogating. So they were getting information about the size and general locations in terms of when they were statically sitting. But the movement itself was the detection of the cavalry, which had gone away. They didn't have very much cavalry.
Right.
But more importantly, Sickles seeing the movement of the forces moving to the Union right.
It's very fascinating. And then, of course, they're going to continue on throughout the war with the Army of the Potomac until that's a thing I want to know. I don't know if I asked this last time. Does the BMI spread throughout all of the armies of the United States, or is it just an AOP thing? It is. It's just the Army of the Potomac.
It's just the Army of the Potomac, but that's in part because some of the intelligence sources that the Union was using, balloons and telegraph, were largely just things that were found in the Eastern Theater. Before the BMI was even created, General Garfield, who later becomes President of the United States, created kind of an all-source unit within the Army of the Cumberland. They just all-source then for that army didn't mean anything but essentially human, right? So spying. But he organized a unit within the Army of the Cumberland, and then when it got moving with Grant used that same organization. He also had some spies of his own that he didn't take down with Shiloh, which is a different intelligence story, is Grant's total failure at Shiloh from intelligence. But they had less intelligence out there. They had less intelligence resources. They relied a lot more on cavalry and then just traditional spying operations. So they didn't have that. But the more important thing I think that's interesting is that for all of its success, when Sharp is the assistant provost general, provost marshal for the Army when the Confederates surrender. So he's overseeing the BMI, which is under the provost's office. So he's the one who actually takes Lee's surrender, and he takes the surrender of more than 20,000 Confederate troops. When all of them have been turned loose, you're going home, and they turn to the Union Army and now say, you get to all go home too. They disbanded the Bureau of Military Information and sent everybody packing to their own states, and they all went home, and the Bureau of Military Information disappears. All of their records were classified. They were boxed up. They were sealed. They were put in the National Archives. And that's the interesting story about nobody knows about the Bureau of Military Information until Fischel, an NSA officer who wanted to write about intel in the Civil War, goes to the National Archives, asks for, hey, what do you have on intel in the Civil War? And they bring up these hundreds of boxes of information.
Wow.
And between 1947 and 1997, he writes his book, which is, 700-800 pages. It's the official work on intelligence of the Civil War.
What's the name of it? Intelligence in the Civil War?
So it's oh my gosh. How did I?
Somebody in the audience know it?
It's
It'll come to you.
Edwin Fischel. Anyway, it's Edwin Fischel's book on intelligence of the Union Army, and it's the my book is so tattered with notes and it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
He writes that, but he dies at the end of it. But if it had never been published, if he didn't get it out there, nobody would still to this day really know about the Bureau of Military Information.
Is that yet another reason? Because there's many reasons, but people always seem to lament, if not question, why is it a focus always on the Eastern Theater? Is it because we have that book now, which gives us more behind-the-scenes information? Is that one of the reasons you think?
Most people are just interested in the Eastern Theater.
I know, it's more interesting. We have the better battles, people. Come on.
I doubt that the people who fought in Stones River would necessarily think that.
Yeah, okay, so you got one or two good ones.
But obviously the centers of gravity of the war are in the Eastern Theater. Lee's army and Richmond are the centers of gravity for the Confederates. Washington is the population's willpower and support for the Union. Those are the centers of gravity. That's principally in the Eastern Theater. Intelligence in the Western Theater is not as complicated or complex as it is in the Eastern Theater. There's a lot more space in the Western Theater. So, it's really a significant factor when you think about it, how compressed the Eastern Theater is.
Yeah, especially in Virginia. It's not like here. Here gives you a bad idea of what Virginia's like.
Yeah, the narrow front from the Chesapeake and Potomac River over to the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's really a narrow pathway, right?
Yep.
And so the two armies are really pretty congested and without a lot of area to maneuver there. So intelligence has its own kind of flavor, whereas in the Western Theater, cavalry really can do a lot of things because there's so much open space. They're just two very different dynamic theaters, but it isn't to say that there isn't written material. So William Feist, a historian, wrote Grant's Secret Service. And even though he carries the book forward respecting Grant's use of intelligence and what he did with respect to it, from Belmont, it's actually called Grant's Secret Service from Belmont to Appomattox, he talks about Grant's use of intelligence and the organization and what type of sourcing that there was and so on, all the way through Grant moving from the Western Theater out here in 1864. And so there is a book that really kind of helps establish what the intelligence picture was like in the Western Theater. And then he comes and takes Grant over what Grant saw out here in the Eastern Theater and kind of takes Fischel's work and then adds to it. And then Pete Soros, who I always applaud, he was a coworker of mine at DIA, written a lot of books. He wrote a very significant biography on George Sharp that just came out a little bit ago, which has also contributed to it. So Fischel putting that work out on the BMI has now enabled people like Feist and Soros to go out and write more books about it, and people like me. So when Pete and I were working together doing the research on the Bureau of Military Information, he wanted to go write the book. I wanted to go do staff rides and write intelligence, shorter articles on lessons learned, and do a 20-part lecture series on intelligence in the Civil War that I used to teach with. So I went more the academic education route. He went in the staff ride. He went more the writing of the book part. But he and I worked together pretty closely on parts of the study of the Bureau of Military Information. That all came about because Edwin Fischel, finding all those records and writing his Secret War for the Union, that's what it's called, the Secret War for the Union. That's Fischel's book. But Fischel, having opened the groundwork, suddenly Sears's work, Stephen Sears's books on the Civil War, you start seeing intelligence. So Sears's works on Chancellorsville talks about the BMI, and his book on Gettysburg talks about the BMI. And most other authors who write about these either came before Fischel put out his book on Intel. So, when you read some of our older historians that talk about the Civil War, they're not talking about intelligence because nobody knew about it. Mm-hmm. But some of the newer books that you read, they have no excuse because the information is out there. So when you read a book on Gettysburg and they're not talking about the Bureau of Military Information and Sharp and the 13 different major collection efforts that were happening in the campaign for Gettysburg and the Union soldiers who dressed up as Confederates and marched in the Confederate line and all of these different things that are happening, there's no excuse anymore for that to be overlooked.
Real quick, I got to start wrapping up because I need to go to the principal's office at 2:00. But what about, you mentioned before the clash between Union cavalry and the BMI, the headbutting or they don't get along. Can you go into a little bit more? What is that exactly about? Why couldn't they work together?
Well, so the cavalry always sees itself as independent, right? So we have our own set of missions and scopes and roles, and we're not here to be subservient to you. So when you say you need information about Jeb Stuart's flank, or like after the Battle of Chancellorsville, like his dispositions and whether or not Lee is moving, towards the Shenandoah Valley. You can give us that requirement, but we have other requirements as well. And by the way, we also have to care about the rear and logistics and. We're not under you. We don't report to you, and so there was real friction there.
But BMI is attached to headquarters, no?
It is. It's attached to the.
Was it that Sharp was taking it upon himself to say, "Hey, I need this information from you," or was Hooker saying, "Cooperate with Sharp"?
He was saying cooperate.
Yeah.
But you can say cooperate all you want. After 9/11, the president said to the intelligence community, "Verily cooperate," right? And that it got better, right? Having somebody actually dictate to you, "Verily thou shalt do this," helps improve it. But if there's not a willingness to actually exert resources and effort to actually collaborate and work together, it doesn't work that well. And in this case, It was when we have information, we'll give it to you. But by the way, we're going to be the first ones to look at it too. So whenever the cavalry would capture somebody, they would always do the interrogation. And then they would give the report to Sharp. And Sharp would be like, you didn't ask all the right questions. If you had asked these other 5 questions, maybe we would have got something. And the cavalry are like, that's not our job. Well, okay, then bring them back here. Not our job, right? So
it's like working for a union. It's like, oh, we got a guy for that. It's not my job.
Right.
It's like, yeah, but you're standing right there. Can you just hand me it?
Yeah, turn the guy over. But they didn't. They would do things their own way, and they never saw it as something like we are obligated to have to report to or be subservient in any way to the intelligence organization. So they would get reports, and during the Gettysburg campaign, Buford going out forward, Buford is providing that information back. Right. Sharp is getting it, so he's seeing the information and he's able to use that information and roll it in with the other sources. Buford's not collecting that information for Sharp, though. Buford's going out forward and collecting information for his boss, who is Pleasanton.
Yeah.
So, and Pleasanton is going over to Meade and to Hooker and saying, "Here's what's happening." Right.
Right.
So there isn't necessarily that direct conduit that Sharp would have liked for there to have been between those two organizations.
All right, so where can people find that lecture series about intelligence in the Civil War? And you
really can't find it online.
Can't find it?
No. So it's instruction that's done. Nobody's just commissioned or had me do this outside of the intelligence community. So it's a series that I do regularly. I do regularly for the intelligence community. It starts with introduction, and we talk about there's briefings on during the Civil War, signals intelligence, open source. There's topical things like women in intelligence and African Americans in intelligence. There's campaigns, so Gettysburg, Shiloh, Monocacy. There's several campaigns that we talk about intelligence. And so by the end of it, you really get a comprehensive kind of picture of intelligence from the people, the places, and the implications. But for the intelligence community, I give this to, a lot of it is on the lessons, like what can we draw from that today, just like the staff rides, what can we draw from history about intelligence that still is applicable today? Like, how do you not make the same mistakes over and over again when they were done 160 years ago?
One thing people can find, though, is a podcast with you, I'm assuming as the guest, and Ed Helms, Andy Bernard from The Office, of course. Everybody loves him. What's the name of that podcast?
So that is called Snafu, and it's about a near-nuclear war scare, a true story that happened in 1983 where the Soviets and the United States nearly came to nuclear war, and neither side really was aware of what was happening.
So that's the name of his show, or that's just what you're on?
Snafu is the name of the show. It's a 7 or 8-part series.
About just that one thing?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. So you can go find that anywhere they have.
It's Apple, everywhere where there's podcasts. Yeah, and it was the winner of the 2023 History Series podcast award.
And then you're working on something else, which I'm sure you probably can't talk about, but you're working on something else with him coming up, right?
With respect to potential film, yeah. So that's
like a documentary film or a narrative film.
We'll just keep that. For right now, we'll see.
Okay. Well, if it's if you need a talking head about Gettysburg, if it's a documentary, let me know. Otherwise, that's it. Thank you very much for, if somebody says addressing intelligence. Yeah, but maybe we should do a show with you. Just call it Addressing Intelligence, and we can...
then I could make the big bucks.
Or you could, yeah,
Like you.
Yeah, right.
I see that Ferrari outside. I see that.
That's the guy next door. He leaves it there. I park down the street and I just pretend to get out of it.
Yours was a Chevelle. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
got it.
On cinder block. No, well, yeah, we should do one with you if you ever wanted to do that. Well, we'll get there because we're starting a network soon, and yeah. Anyway,
Whatever. I love doing these. So.
Yeah, and you're very good at it too. Like you really did. Like I could have gone and taken a nap under the table, and you could have just kept going. So
I think at one point you might.
I almost did.
Yeah.
No, I like listening to you, and I don't really have anything to add because you answer all the questions that pop into my head. Like a second later, you answer them, so that's good. Thank you guys for watching. Let's see, the Secret War for the Union. Yeah, okay, everybody got it there. Damn you, 6Q. Blah blah blah. All right, great. Soros book is really good. Okay, so it's spelled Tsour. I was like, oh, it's one of those George Soros sons.
He's written, so one of his books is the Big Book of Military Quotes, and it's like 700 pages of just military quotes throughout all of history. He's written like 30 history books. He's an amazing guy.
Well, we'll check it out. I'm going to get a hold of that, and that's an interesting topic, the intelligence. I think it's really interesting. There's so much still yet to learn about the Civil War. And like we don't even really scratch the surface on the show. And we've done like 600 shows.
Well, and you and I mentioned that like all the telegraphs that still have not been deciphered yet.
Tell the audience about that real quick before we go. So tell them this is. Oh no, don't, because this is going to be our. Yeah,
we'll do something else on that. It's just interesting to just throw out there that there's whole issues out there that are completely unexplored still with respect to the Civil War that could open up huge apertures of information.
I'll put it to you like this: there's a pile of papers that no one knows the contents of. Invisible ink? We don't know. You'll have to wait and find out and see if we can get our little project off the ground. Otherwise, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your continued support and listening to this show. And check out the podcast with Ed Helms. And that's about it, guys. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you very much.
All right. We are done.
I thought that went well. That went better than I think the others even.
I agree. See you guys. Wish me luck. I'm going to meet with the principal.